Hello everyone. Today we are going to touch base and kind of go over chapter 3 and what I found as going through everything as to what I found was important, what I feel like everyone else should know. One of the main things to start with is that this chapter is filled with a lot of basics that I feel like we will need throughout this semester. Things that will give us a better idea of what we're doing in our own subjects. What gives us the characteristics of a juvenile delinquent? That in itself kind of is a broad topic. There are things within that topic that one might not think of. Things that might come as shocking to you, may not come as shocking to you, things you possibly already knew. One of the first things that the chapter talks about is what you will learn as you go through the chapter, what is felt like the concepts that will be grasped. The first thing that the chapter talks about is the subtle delinquency details. What makes a delinquent? The behavior, the profiles, just the delinquency profiles in general. The next thing is the characteristics and factors that go into a juvenile delinquent. Those things in itself are kind of self-explanatory. Those characteristics and factors make up a majority of what is important for a juvenile delinquent, why they are the way they are. The next thing is the outside and inside factors that affect juvenile delinquents. These are factors that also come into play other than just the characteristics. The outside and inside factors tell you why a juvenile delinquent is the way they are. That in itself is also very important, just because it gives you a look as to what got them started into being a juvenile delinquent. Nobody just wakes up one day and says, hey, I'm going to be a juvenile delinquent. Usually it has factors that go into that bring them to the point that they are. We'll talk about that later as we go through the slides and through the chapter. The next thing is the physical attributes of a juvenile delinquent. These physical attributes are the basics: your gender, your age, your race. These things also play a very important role, as we'll talk about that later as well. Going forth, so just some basic facts that were talked about within the first little bit before the chapter really got started, just kind of giving you more of an introduction. Juvenile delinquents usually come from places or families that are very lower socioeconomic families and neighborhoods. Those things play a huge role. One may not realize how big of a role that they play, but they play a huge role into juvenile delinquents in general. Things such as their type of housing, the way that they live. Some houses are dirty, not necessarily dirty, but there's no cleanliness. There's no order to the home. There's nothing. Poor medical care. They may get sick. They may have like a very horrible sickness, and just they can't do anything about it. They can't afford the medication. They can't afford the doctor's visits. They can't afford anything that would try and get them better. They pretty much just have to wait it out. They also have a very higher unemployment rate. Those rates are more likely because once you become a juvenile delinquent, or you're around others that have been delinquents, whether they're adults or they're juvenile delinquents as well, they're not going to show up to jobs. They're not going to want to partake in anything. They wake up one morning and say, hey, I don't want to go. They're not going to go. I want to say children, but these juveniles that are within this areas or these types of area are also very much exposed to violence. They're in areas that people like you and I would go driving down the road, get lost on some back road somewhere, and think, oh my gosh, this is not good, this looks dangerous. They're more so in areas of those types. The next thing that is a very big basic, they differ from young men to young women. In the beginning of the chapter talks about how young men, you see different characteristics that are within them, and then with women or young women, you see different characteristics that are within them as well. We will talk about that a little bit later once we get more so into the physical attributes of a juvenile delinquent. But going forth, everything that is within this chapter, you notice that is all based on official statistics. Each one of these statistics brings you information that has been studied, it has been researched, and it has pretty much been looked over front and back to a T to tell you that this information is what is correct. This is what has been found. The next big thing that I found was very interesting was the fact that juveniles that have committed crimes or have been within all kinds of delinquent attributes or things of that nature have not actually been labeled as delinquents. They have been noticed as juveniles that just come and go with these things, with the violence or with the crimes that they commit, or just petty crimes and things of that nature. One of the biggest things that is talked about within this chapter, within the characteristics of a juvenile delinquent, is the social factors. These factors play a role in these children from the time that they are born to the time that they become a juvenile delinquent, and so on and so forth. It even can roll into the times in which they are adults. These things, people do not realize how big of a role that they play. For instance, just with social factors in general, families play a huge role. The things you observe as a child that your family around you do, no one takes into consideration what that does to you as you continue to grow up. The book stated the greater the risk factors, the greater the likelihood it is that somebody is going to participate in that awful behavior. You see awful behavior, you will mimic that behavior, and you will continue to do so because you do not know the difference between right and wrong. The first thing that we had mentioned was families. Families is a huge social factor just based on they're there all the time. Children and juveniles see them, they think, hey, I can do that. The next big thing is school. It doesn't really, not that I noticed touched very big base-wise on schools as a huge social factor. It is, but it isn't. It also goes along with peers, because you're around all of these people day in and day out. What you're around plays a factor in your behavior as well, just as much as families. Your teachers give you negative behavior. They tell you you're going to do this, you're going to do that. You're not going to amount to things. You're going to continue to believe that, and you're just going to follow because you think, hey, they don't think I'm going to do anything. I'm just going to continue to follow what they believe that I am. That's peers as well. Your peers tell you, we talk about bullying a lot anymore with children, that it's getting worse. That the more your peers down you, the more you down yourself. You're going to continue to be what they think that you are. You believe what you hear, not necessarily what you see, which in some cases you can as well. But in general, your peers play a huge factor. The next big thing is community. The area in which you're raised, not just family-wise, but your neighborhood, your surrounding community within your cities, within your towns. They really just, it's hard to say, but a lot of communities are trying to do things that help these students, children, juvenile delinquents, whichever way that you choose to look at it. They try to help them better themselves, give them these opportunities within these programs that they do, kind of like the community policing that we've learned about in other classes. Those things help these kids stay out of trouble. It gives them that example that they need, instead of giving them a community filled with violence, filled with gangs, filled with drugs and alcohol and all kinds of terrible things that delinquents get into that make them who they are. It helps build on what they've already learned, and it continues to go until they become no longer just a juvenile delinquent, but an adult who is continuing to commit crimes. Those types of areas, those types of communities that do not have those, I want to say the community policing, I know that's not necessarily the correct term, but who has those types of things that bring those kids in, those seriously make a difference. People may not think that, but they really, really do. The next well, I want to say the next, but one of the biggest things too with this is that education. Like you saw with school, it's so important to get your education. It shapes the child, it shapes their future. What you put in is what you get out. You don't put in education, you don't put in the time, you are going to get out nothing from it. The social classes, I know that's not necessarily within the list that the chapter breaks down. It is in there as a highlight of a section. It tells you that the social class plays a huge role. It's more likely for a child or juvenile that is within a lower socioeconomic status, more lower class, that they are more likely to get into trouble. They're the children that have a single parent household is also more likely, because that parent is trying to do what they can to make them stay above water and to be able to live, and so that child is more so on their own, which is also where you see the term the latchkey children. Those I feel like are very important. We've learned those not only throughout the criminal justice world, but we also learned it back in elementary school, middle school, high school. It's the children in the time where families worked. The moms, the dads, they worked. And then the children would have a key around their neck, and they would go home and they would let themselves in. That would be the latchkey children. That's where that term came from. Children that are still doing that today in some form or another, they have no supervision. They are more likely to go into do things that they know that they're not supposed to do and get wrapped into bad behavior, bad scenes, bad crowds, just because they have no one there to tell them that they shouldn't. Another big thing is gangs. Chapter 3 doesn't really talk about it very much, but it does say that it will touch base on it later on in the book. Gangs can play a huge part just based on community. You have gangs in your community, and you have people that are trying to influence the child or the juvenile. They're going to get wrapped into that. They're going to be more accessible to those things, and they're going to know that, hey, these are people that I can surround myself with, and they'll just continue to follow. Another big thing is drugs that this chapter talks about, chapter 3. They have a huge effect on anyone, but juvenile delinquents in general, since that's what we're mostly depicting on, they play a huge role. It's hard to say. Juvenile delinquents usually partake in drugs or get addicted to them or touch base with them just because of who they surround themselves with. So if you notice, there's a pattern. Everything starts from your family and goes outward. So the more that you surround yourself with these people that have these things, those characteristics are going to continue to rub off on you. Then those in turn will be your characteristics. That is what makes up a juvenile delinquent. These characteristics. The book touches base on crack, touches base on methamphetamines, and they tell you what they do. They tell you how people get wrapped into them. They tell you how long they've been, crack used to be the main thing that everyone was into, and now it's methamphetamines. It's just things like that juveniles get into because of gangs, because of who they're around. There's peers, their family, you're surrounded by it, you absorb it, you continue, and you there in turn act in such a way. The next thing would be, the next thing that touches base on is those physical factors. What makes up a person just in general, not juvenile delinquents, just makes up a person. So your age, your gender, your race, each of those things make up a person, but each of those things also make up a juvenile delinquent. So the age in the book that it talks about, children, and I would just say children in that instance, because children that are under the age of 10, nothing really happens to them. If they do something, it does not affect them like it does, but it does not, because they cannot really be tried. The age range that is the main issue for juvenile delinquents in general is the age range from 10 to 18. Anything over 18, they're not considered juveniles. They are then considered to be adults. They are tried as adults, and they are continued as such. It doesn't really, it It talks about serious offenses, less serious offenses. There's also an illustration in the book. I'm not sure if you guys took a look at. There's an illustration in the book that gives you the ages in general. It goes from total ages, under the age of 15, under the age of 18, 18 years of age and over. It tells you the acts, the offense charge that was committed. It tells you when, and it tells you the percent change from year to year. How many people were convicted of these things? I don't think it breaks down based on gender, but it does break down based on age, and that in itself is a huge thing. I mean, things that are on this list that you wouldn't even think that a child under the age of 18, even close to 10, could commit, but it is possible. The next big thing other than age is gender. Gender, as we mentioned earlier, so that we touch base on again, men and women commit different crimes. They commit the same crimes as well as different crimes. It's really hard to say that they don't commit the same crimes, because they do, but sometimes it's in different forms. One of the biggest things that I found, which was very fascinating for me, was that 3 to 4 arrests of males to every 1 female. Males are more likely to commit these crimes. It doesn't say that women are not more likely or less likely. I mean, just that statistic in general proves that men are very much more likely to do so. Women just may not get caught, as bad as that sounds, but it's possible. Usually, as the book says, that females are overlooked. People don't think, hey, this woman right here is going to go commit this felony. They're going to go murder someone. They're going to go, become a sex offender. Things of that nature is just more unlikely to not necessarily believe, but to really take in, that you think that this woman that you see in front of you, or this young woman that you see in front of you, is going to go commit that kind of crime. It's just not as knowledgeable. Females definitely have different issues than men. Men kind of lash out just because that, not necessarily in all cases, but men, that's just what they do. Females, they've been abused, they've harmed themselves. Their social attributes play a huge factor into things. Women talk down to other women just because they find that it helps them. That is a terrible thing, but it's usually a big factor because women like to down other women. And I find the older that I get, the more likely that it is. Mom shaming is a huge thing that I could totally believe that females, just young women, see that, like these adults shaming other women, and then they want to do something about it. I can totally believe that. Men, it shows that aggression and destructiveness, it's more of a factor for them than women. Women do have aggression, but they do it in different ways. The last thing that the book touches on is race. Race has been a huge thing in our world today. It has been something that people don't want to talk about. If it is talked about, it's just not something that people wish to really go into. It's a terrible thing. It really is that people are still judged based on the color of their skin, based on the race that they are, but it is still happening today, and I can see how that plays a huge role for juveniles. Let's see. It doesn't really say, like, statistically one race or the other. It does say that it is more likely that groups that are in a minority, that live in lower socioeconomic classes, they are more likely to commit those crimes, which would make sense because they are in those areas. Minorities might not necessarily live in the lower incomes, If you're not in the minority and you live in the lower socioeconomic classes, it's likely for you to be a juvenile delinquent as well because you're exposed to those things. All in all of these factors play a huge role in juvenile delinquents. I feel like they're all equally important. One over the other is not a bigger factor than another. They're all important. They all show the same role, and they're all just important. But that is all I have time for. I do thank you guys for listening, and I hope that you guys got a good bit out of this chapter, just like I did. Thank you.